It's pleasant to look back and reminisce on the mischievous deceptions of the past, but for all of us in the room who are acutely aware of our own vulnerability in the digital age, these deceptions now have a much more direct effect on our daily lives. You don't have to be a beautiful maiden by the side of the river for Zeus to take an interest in you anymore. Everyone's now a target. Since my experience being catfished, I've been at the center of a global conversation about how individuals identify themselves in the fast evolving digital world. Let's see. Does that come up?
I don't know.
Let's see. Here we go. As we all know, cell phones are now something we all carry with us all the time. And
can we have the lights down, though?
Oh, sure. Well, I think they have the lights up for the cameras. But can you guys, you can see that, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Just for reference, I thought this was sort of a breathtaking example of how things have changed. Same image, essentially, of the Pope addressing the crowd at Vatican City. One picture taken in 2005, and then another in 2013. I think the difference is pretty obvious. But it's no wonder now that our society has become increasingly digitized. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit are some of the things that, similar to the themes we just heard, are still very present in our culture and society. Of course, you mentioned the famous story of Jacob and Esau. Mm-hmm. And just like Jacob, modern-day identity thieves figure out your vulnerability and exploit it, whether it's your social security number, your credit card, or even your Facebook login. Identity theft is, in fact, so pervasive that a couple years ago, there was a major Hollywood film made, some of you may have seen, called Identity Theft. And of course, it was a comedy, but certainly did not make light of the fact that it's a real problem and it's happening quite often. In fact, every year, 9 million Americans fall victim to identity theft. And Americans experience financial losses to the tune of about $50 billion each year because of identities that are stolen online. And according to CNN, identity fraud hits new victims every 2 seconds.
Wow.
So, while Zeus used to do it in a very charming way, and you even suggested perhaps it wouldn't be so bad to have a god seduce you under disguise. Nowadays, seduction...
Only if your name is Europa.
These days, seduction is not quite as enjoyable, and it often leads to terrible results, most often financially. The difference being that Jacob, back then, had to stand in front of his father, though his eyesight was failing, and physically pretend to be someone else. Of course, now we've removed the human element, which is probably why it's happening so frequently. Mm-hmm. Anybody from anywhere in the world can, from behind a computer screen, find out about you, your interests, determine your vulnerabilities, and sadly deceive you, and as a result, take your identity. So we're more connected, and as that has made us much more vulnerable, shape-shifting is something that we see more and more. Technology has changed and, of course, allowed us to greatly alter the way we look. Nowadays, obviously, it's done with Photoshop. Here you have a picture that, with just a couple simple clicks of a mouse, mm-hmm. has been pretty significantly altered. Same person, mm-hmm. but appears very differently. Whether it's small changes in appearance or dramatic changes, many people now change the way they look in an effort to appeal to someone else, whether it's sexually or because they're looking to seduce someone. In the story of Zeus, he pretended to be someone else to elicit sexual favors, and in other words, someone in power, in this case on the internet, who has the ability to influence others to gain their attention sexually or perhaps even solicit some sort of sexual favor. And this is where it can get really scary. While I thought you were going to say.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, so, again, in the charming stories of the past, Zeus rains down in a shower of gold, but sadly, as you pointed out, it ends in the murder of her father. These days, the results are slightly different, but equally as scary. This is a photo of me and a young lady who hosted an episode of my show with me. Her name is Cassidy Wolf. And Cassidy, a few years ago, was the victim of something called sextortion.
What is sextortion?
Yeah, you may not be familiar with it, but essentially,
A new word.
what happened was Cassidy was, like many teenagers, on her computer. She received an email from a friend of hers that she went to school with, and opened the email to find a link to a website and a line of text that read, "Hey, this is so funny, I think you'd really like it, check it out." She clicked on the website, but interestingly, it led her to sort of a dead link. Didn't look like anything, and there was no video or image to laugh about. So she closed it and really didn't think much of it. What she didn't know was that her friend's email had been hacked by another student at their school. And he had sent her this link, and by clicking on it, she unknowingly gave him access to the webcam on her laptop.
Does that mean he could watch her?
Exactly.
Oh.
And so for the next year, this young man, a classmate of Cassidy, collected video and photos of her, much like the ones you see here, and eventually sent her an email and said, with one or two of the photos he had sort of screenshotted, said, "Hey, I have these pictures and many more. What I'd like you to do is start sending me videos that I'm going to request. And I'm going to ask you to do things for me. And if you don't do them, I'm going to release these videos to all the students at the school. And I'm going to put them on the internet, and I'm going to ruin your reputation, and it'll be humiliating and embarrassing."
Oh.
Terrible. Fortunately, Cassidy told her mom. They went to the police. The FBI got involved.
And they found him?
They did discover who was behind it, and she did not have her private
Life
exposed the way that he had threatened. But that's just an example of how someone can, in this case, pose as a friend, someone that you trust, gain access to something like this, and then, unfortunately, in a failed effort, try to exploit you for some other means.
This whole business of hacking is frightening.
It is.
But
I mean, I know, like many of you, I'm constantly worried that perhaps my passwords are not strong enough, or if I don't know if anyone here uses the cloud to store pictures, but
I can't remember all my passwords.
well, and it's every day in the news we're hearing about different celebrities
Yeah.
whose pictures get exposed,
Yeah.
or it's a real problem. So while Zeus was doing it thousands of years ago, people are still doing it today. Now, pretending to be a different gender, in the case of the 12th night, is something people still do very often. I see it on my show quite a bit because many people don't feel comfortable exploring their sexuality as their own gender. So they do it as the opposite. In a statistical analysis of Catfish, 24% of the people that have been on my program have pretended to be of the opposite sex. And the latest research shows that the average age of someone who comes out of the closet is between 14 and 16, Yet more than half of children have used an online social network by the age of 10. So you can see there's a period of time when young people are exploring their sexuality, and of course they're doing it online. So what we see a lot is someone, maybe a teenager, who's not comfortable yet, or perhaps not certain yet that they are gay, rather than going online as themselves and talking to other men or women, they'll create a fake account of someone of the opposite sex so that they can safely engage with the gender of their preference in a heterosexual relationship. And oftentimes it goes from exploration and curiosity to friendship to relationship to love, and before they know it, they're so far in and so wrapped up in this relationship, they don't know how to tell the truth, and obviously much to the surprise of the other person, reveal their true gender. probably the most notable story of this, you might remember from a few years ago, was Manti Te'o, the famous Notre Dame football player who, for I think about a year and a half, thought he had a beautiful girlfriend who had claimed to have met him once before, named Leda, and she took him on a roller coaster of a ride in terms of her getting sick and having to go kind of away for a period of time, and there were deaths in the family, eventually ending in her saying, a friend of hers telling Manti Te'o that she had in fact passed away. And the whole nation mourned with him and was very sad for him. It made the news, only to then discover that his online girlfriend, not only had she not existed, but she'd all been the creation of a friend of his, this young man, Ronaya. And it was really actually happening right around the first season of Catfish, and it was the first really big story after my own that showed people that there are a lot of individuals pretending to be people that they're not.
It's the most amazing story. I remember seeing it on one of the late night shows.
Sure. So, moving on. A Midsummer Night's Dream, sadly, is no longer so dreamy. Nowadays, believe it or not, while Oberon and Titania are an unhappy couple fighting and quarreling about a handsome young boy that Titania had brought back from her travels, Oberon wanted him, and Titania said no. Well, one thing I hear people telling me a lot is about women in relationships who create female accounts to engage with and flirt with their partners to see how loyal their partner is.
It sounds so complicated.
So, so in this case, you know, if Oberon had wanted to get back at or find out just how loyal Titania was, rather than the mischief of Shakespeare's play, perhaps he might have pretended to seduce her under someone else and see if she'd go for it. In fact, we now know that there are over 1 billion Facebook profiles, and at least 170 million of them are fake. So
Isn't that amazing?
whether it's young kids pretending to be a different gender or people in relationships creating fake profiles to find out if their loved ones are as loyal as they hope or perhaps suspect they're not, it's a real problem. So one of the first stories we actually did on my show was very similar to this. It was about a young girl who had been friendly with another young girl who was dating a guy at the time, but then they broke up and the first girl started dating him. But he was still involved with his ex as a friend, and there was a question of fatherhood in terms of whether he had in fact fathered her child. It's all very complicated, but essentially the current girlfriend, in an effort to distract and keep the ex away, created a fake profile of a guy, flirted with her, and for years led her to believe that she was in a loving relationship with someone just simply so she would stop pursuing her, her now current boyfriend. It's very complicated, but it's happening all the time, and it's shares a lot of the themes of a Shakespeare play. In fact, I should probably write it down because they might make for a really great stage production.
They'd be no more complicated than Shakespeare's.
That's right, perhaps more so. Now, of course, Cyrano de Bergerac is a comparison that a lot of people make to my show. And in many ways is the classic tale of love and what does one do when they find that they are perhaps not attractive to the one that they long for. Mm-hmm. And the use of disguise of the same gender, but someone perhaps more physically attractive than you, is something that we see quite often. In fact, over the first 4 seasons of Catfish, of the 73% of people who did use a fake photo to represent themselves, only 49% actually use a picture of the same gender. So while there are a lot of people switching genders, I would say about half are just using pictures of a better looking version of themselves. And according to Pew data from 2013, 54% of online daters have felt that someone else seriously misrepresents themselves in their profile. which of course implies that millions of profiles include some large form of deception. Irving Goffman, a sociologist, believes that this sort of editing of oneself to shape the impression we make on others sits at the core of social interaction. We want to appear as similar as possible to the object of our interaction because acceptance secures our place within our networks.
True enough. Mm-hmm.
So it's quite frequently that people are approaching one another using pictures of someone that they know will be more attractive to the person of their desires. And as a result, these relationships are, sadly, for the people involved, not going well, but fortunately for me, turning into episodes of my show. Because once the relationship goes from friendship to perhaps flirtation, and then flirtation to relationship, oftentimes the person wearing the mask doesn't know how to take it off, doesn't know when appropriate time to tell the person they've been communicating with every day for months or years that in fact the entire relationship is built on a lie. Using false photos of yourself is so popular that a dating app called Badoo, which has over 300 million users, actually now introduced something called photo verification in an effort to perhaps deal with this growing problem. Now, if you don't...
How can it be solved? I don't understand how one could possibly solve this.
Yeah. If I had an answer, I think I'd probably suggest it. There are things like photo verification. Other social media networks now require that each profile on their network is linked directly to a phone number. So you can't just create countless profiles. You have to actually have a registered phone number for each profile, which seems to help. But I think, sadly, the responsibility still falls to the user. So in my case, I got catfished. This was the image of the girl that I thought I was talking to for about 9 months, along with her friends and family, who were all Facebook friends of mine. It started with a simple message on MySpace. It turned into, like I said, many Facebook friends and emails. In fact, members of my family were talking to members of Megan's family. We were all getting along, planning trips together. It was pretty
Except that nothing
intimate.
ever worked out.
Well, right, except every time
she was supposed to arrive, something happened and
that's
she
right.
didn't arrive.
Her car would break down, or she fell asleep behind the wheel.
Or the child got sick.
That's right, that's right, exactly. And only after going to Michigan finally and knocking on her door did I discover that Megan was in fact Angela. And Angela had been living in Michigan, as you'd mentioned, and had sadly never been able to pursue the life she had dreamed of as a dancer, living in New York. And so she used pictures of that other girl, reached out to me, and subsequently made 15 other profiles, all on Facebook, with pictures of different people that she had found either from her local community or randomly online, to flesh out and make a convincing world for me to sort of stumble into and discover over the course of those 9 months.
But Angela was the most imaginative liar I've ever heard of in my life. I mean, but then one must excuse her because she was the caretaker of those two profoundly retarded men.
That's right.
They're 30, so I guess at night she had to dream up something to amuse, to fantasize, to make a life for herself, and that's what she did. But
well, just like Cyrano, Angela was extremely intelligent and very bright and talented, but just simply, amongst many circumstantial things, didn't feel the way she wanted to feel, didn't look the way she wanted to look. And so for her, logging in and living as this young lady, and of course many other people, and being able to talk to me and feel the flirtation and love that I was giving her was her best option.
Yeah.
In fact, 81% of people lie about their height, weight, or age in dating profiles, not so surprisingly. And this is an interesting little graphic. It's hard. I don't know if you can make that all out, but 65% of females reported that their date had lied about how tall they were. 68% of females reported that men had lied about their age. On the male side, 65% of males reported that their date had lied about their weight, or 58% of males reported that their date was a different size than they had listed. 57% of males reported that their online date had lied about their income. 66% of females reported that their online daters looked nothing like their profile pictures suggested at all. So clearly the consistency here in how we choose to present ourselves or how we wish we looked is nothing new. And it's simply now taking on a new form. The Cornell study found that women and men generally subtract 8.5 pounds when describing their weight. And men generally say they're about 2 inches taller than they actually are. So while Cyrano's choice to deceive ended in tragedy, unfortunately, these days there's a lot less at stake when you're creating your online profile, which is probably why so many people do it. Essentially, it's deception, and whatever theme or whatever you're after, it's something that's been happening for a long time. Oops, excuse me. Oh. And like my grandmother said, deception has been part of the human experience throughout the ages. Nowadays, not only is it easier to lie to each other, but even more so to lie to ourselves. With the ever-evolving presentation of ourselves, from our physical appearance to our digital footprint, human beings seem inclined to editing themselves with filters on Instagram or a detail on a dating profile. It seems we're never good enough. As human connection becomes increasingly digital, it only becomes easier to justify and practice deception when the thing you're deceiving is only an avatar or an email. Perhaps the deep-rooted desires and tendencies seen through examples throughout history are built into our DNA. And might we be seeing a trend now of that desire being unlocked by the accessibility and ease of technology to allow one to alter and or completely change their identity or assume someone else's? Clearly, we make a case that deception, insofar as it relates to human interaction and love, is not a new thing. But is it getting worse? Or are we just changing the way we do it?
We leave that to you to answer. Thank you. Thank you. Now, really good, Nev, really good. Now we're going to open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions.
We have a very eager question here. Well, only because I was instructed to repeat the question. After mentioning how handsome and charming I was, the young lady asked, why would I go through a 9-month digital and email relationship with someone when there are plenty of young women in New York to pursue? And it's, I've had a lot of time to think about that. Did someone say like me? It's funny, making the show the last 5 years, I have asked that question to many other people many times. And one of the things that we've discovered, and I think it's true throughout the ages and in many of the stories and literature and myths that we've talked about, is that mystery seems to be perhaps the greatest aphrodisiac. The less we know about someone or something, the more we want to know. And sure, there are plenty of women here in New York I could have pursued, but I know those women, or I've dated those women, or I think I know them. This was a girl who was so different from what I was familiar with. She lived on a horse farm. She,
she was the perfect woman. She was not only beautiful, but she could play the guitar.
Right.
She composed her own music.
That's right.
She could can vegetables that she grew. She trained horses, and she foaled.
That's right.
Foaled horse. What is that word?
I
when do you help a horse
birthed.
To birth the horse, right. Incidentally, Nev is expecting his daughter next month.
I have a foal on the way. A foal. Foal. Anyway, so that's part of it, and I think also what's been so interesting for me to realize is perhaps you just want what you can't have. And she was so perfect and different and interesting and unlike anybody I'd ever met. And I think we all sort of, perhaps many of us who grew up in the city or live here now, dream about leaving and living on a farm somewhere in the country. And well, maybe not, but I always sort of did. Anyway, so that's as best answer I can give. Okay, we have a question all the way in the back, and then I'll get to you. Sure. Well, I'm curious to know what's next for you. You can answer that after.
All right, you go first.
What's
The question, sorry, is again, just because I'm obligated to repeat, after complimenting me and my show and telling me how obsessed she is with what I do, the young lady asked about what's next for me, what I'd like to do after my show, which may or may not be in its final season now. Many things. Right now, I'm most excited for fatherhood, which is right around the corner. But I've definitely been exposed to and I think tapped into a real growing problem in this country especially, which is mental health. A lot of young people don't have the resources or don't know where the resources are or don't feel comfortable seeking out and engaging with the resources they need to feel better or improve their situation, whether that specifically relates to mental health or perhaps education or arts and culture. There's a problem where I don't think young people are getting the access they need to improve their situation. And so I'd like to work on ways to improve that through advocacy and an organization that I'm involved with called ATTN, or Attention, which is all about, it's a media platform designed to inform and engage my generation around important issues in mental health and education and healthcare and getting better jobs and access to opportunities. So that seems to be the direction I'm going in. I'm not sure where that will lead me. But if anybody in here is looking for someone to host a television show, I'm also available for that.
I can see him as the next Anderson Cooper, can't you? Of course, that's Grandma talking, but...
What's next for Grandma?
Well, I'd like to take all my lectures and put them together in a book, so that's one thing. And I'd certainly like to get better at bridge than I am.
We had a question here in the front.
You asked the question, what can be done to make it stop? I have the answer right here. It's a law
Great.
to prevent romance scams. So my question is, will you please read this and get back to me and help me change the law to stop romance?
Yes, in fact, Joyce, that would be great. Joyce is an author and I guess someone who's introducing possible legislation.
Les Max, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for coming, Joyce. Max and I have actually been discussing for years now introducing some legislation to try and prevent romance scams, as you mentioned.
I want to make clear, before I came here tonight, I was at a symposium with a lot of very knowledgeable people who are trying to make a law to prevent sextortion. So I'm really thrilled that you brought that up this evening.
Great.
I was with Rebecca Seawright, who's the assembly person for this district and my district.
Mm-hmm.
I live on Roosevelt Island. And she's a diehard feminist, and this law would be gender neutral. It's not just for feminists. I get called a feminazi all the time. I'm not. It's a humanist issue, not a feminist issue.
Thank you, Joyce.
No one should be scammed.
We agree.
We agree.
Yeah, over here in the aisle.
Do you think it's getting better or worse with dating apps about all the different measures like happen where you have to pass someone, or are I feel like there's like I don't want to pen pal? Do you think it's getting worse with them or it's helping the situation?
Yeah, the question was obviously with the continued rise of dating apps and the various different forms and continued growing subscribers, is the problem of romance scams or deception growing? I don't have an exact answer. I do like to remind people that lots of happy couples do sort of meet and find each other online. It's
true.
not just lies and deception. A lot of people go on there with the intent to actually be honest and meet someone and fall in love, and that does happen.
I have met 2 couples who told me that they met each other on the internet, and I was surprised.
The joke, the joke though is always, if you need my help meeting the person you're in love with, that's not a good sign. You're probably not going in the direction you want to be going. But I do think there's an increased pressure for people to look a certain way. I mean, I don't know how many of you are active Instagram users, but nowadays there's so many accounts, and they're all the most popular, and so they show up the most on your sort of discover page, and they're on websites, and people are constantly looking at models. I mean, I think more than ever now, models are famous. The more fans you have, and the more likes you get, the more important you seem to be. And unfortunately, I think that's giving a lot of young people a bad sort of impression of themselves, feeling as though they don't have the likes, and if they don't look like that,
Right.
something's not good about them. And so perhaps we need to be much more actively talking to kids now so that they don't grow up going on these websites and dating apps misrepresenting themselves because they feel like they're inadequate in some way, which is not a totally new idea, of course, but certainly I think happening more and more. So perhaps it is growing.
I bet.
How do you scrutinize applicants for your
The question is, how do we scrutinize applicants for my show? And it is quite a process. I think through our casting website and my email, we probably get 50 to 100 emails a day. People who are in relationships, and many of them are silly and sometimes just jokes. Some of them are teenagers who say, I started talking to this guy 3 days ago, and I think he's the one. Obviously, we're not interested in that story. We're looking for people who have really developed long-term, meaningful relationships. But it's funny, we've actually now twice in the last 80 episodes that we've made had someone who created a story, whether it was specifically created for the show or whether it was created amongst the participants. They catfished the show. So they actually got on the show because they in one case, it was 2 girls who lived in New York and California who pretended to have never met and didn't know for sure if they were real, so that they could get a free trip across the country because they couldn't afford to do it themselves.
And you fell for it?
We fell for it. We figured it out about halfway through.
Yeah.
And decided to keep going because it was such a charming story that these 2 girls were in love and wanted to meet, so we thought, okay, well, why not?
No, go on. I was just thinking of that other story you told me about the woman who lived somewhere and she was getting messages from beyond.
Man.
Oh, do you remember that one? And then,
Yeah. And then
tell that story, because that was a great story.
Okay.
All right.
We did an episode this season, actually. I'll try and tell it quickly.
Because you were in Palm Beach.
Right. We were in Orlando. We were in Florida.
You were near me because you
Oh, that's
called and
right.
said, could you have dinner?
That's right.
Right.
Like any good grandson. I was in the state of Florida, so of course I was obligated
In the
to.
state.
We had a story where a young girl, I think she was 19, for 4 years had been talking to a woman from a totally different state who had seemingly no connection to her or her family, who claimed to be in communication with the young girl's deceased father. the father had come to her in a vision and was apparently sort of in between, and was, I think, hoping to perhaps make right what he had left wrong in his life. And I don't want to bum everybody out, but he had really left things poorly. And as much as we looked into it, and as hard as we tried to find fault in her story or some sort of crack, we couldn't. And I don't want to necessarily say I am a believer in the afterlife and mediums, but I certainly can't find any reason not to believe it after meeting this woman. So, we've seen all kinds of stories, and who knows what we'll see next. Yes, in the back there with the, yeah.
So I'm just really curious, having seen your grandson go through it, what advice would you give someone to ensure that they potentially decrease the fact that they might actually be catfish?
Look,
So
what kind of
What-
advice would I give?
what advice would you give to me or anybody about protecting yourself from deception of this sort?
Well, I always go in with a raised eyebrow. I'm sorry. You have to prove it to me before I believe it. So I need proof. I just would not. I just can't see myself getting involved with a stranger over the internet. But that's me. Maybe it's just many years of walking on this earth. I tend not to believe everything I hear, right?
Yes, and some advice that I give, it's always so interesting to me how few people in online relationships or any kind of internet correspondence are seemingly afraid to ask for proof, are embarrassed or feel that it's somehow inappropriate or even creepy to ask someone to prove that they are who they are, because it suggests that you don't believe that they are that person, which they then feel is some sort of reflection on how much they actually care for or love that. And so people won't ask because they feel that that's strange, or they won't Google someone because they think that's stalkery to look someone up.
Yeah.
And it's not. I mean, that's the first thing I do when I meet someone, or even if I'm going to a meeting with someone, before I meet them, I want to know as much as I can about them. So yeah, you got to ask for someone, and if they say no, or if they have an excuse after the second or third time, it's because they clearly don't want you to know something about themselves. Yes, over here in the back.
How much of what you're talking about is just the internet, and how much is on websites like Match.com, Christians Meet, JDate?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the question was, where do most of the stories?
Don't they vet them when you go to a place like singles.com?
Right.
Or then
Yeah.
you have to be vetted. You have to fill out long forms, I think,
Right.
of information about yourself. So that you have an agency.
It's interesting. Most of the stories on my show come from younger people. Well, that's just because MTV is looking for younger people to put on the show, but who find that just randomly, usually it's on Facebook, someone sends them a friend request, or it could be Instagram or Twitter. It's usually from social networks. Of course, there are plenty of people who get deceived on more serious dating apps. Generally, it's a bit more of a scam in that case, because joining those sites often requires a subscription or a membership. You have to pay for it, and then, like my grandmother said, there's 100 questions that you have to answer before you can engage with someone. But I've heard of many stories where people on those types of sites are falling in love, and then unfortunately it often ends with the person of their adoration saying, "Oh, I'll fly to meet you now, send me $1,000 so I can buy a plane ticket." And they do, and then of course they never hear from them again. So it's happening a lot. Those people just are called thieves, and they are not usually interested in being on television because they're criminals. Yeah. Oh, is it almost time? Okay.
Well,
all right.
I know.
Oh, we got one last question here.
One more question. I received some emails saying lead agent saying. The question is, what kind of a picture should I post?
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.